I've previously done cross-sectional surveys of the first wave long haulers at the 6, 12, 18 and 24-month marks. Now we're at 2.5 years for those of us who caught COVID back in February or March or April 2020. And I thought it was worth following up and seeing how many of us are recovering from long COVID, which, spoiler, could actually be a significant proportion. So stick around and let's go through it. Let's dive straight in. We had 1,026 respondents, 68% of whom became ill in March 2020. Who were this cohort? Well, 79% were women, mostly between 35 and 54, mostly from the UK, but also the United States, Europe, Scandinavia and Canada, and a few more places besides. About half of this cohort completed the previous 2-year survey, and because this data is anonymous, I can't directly compare the two sets of data, so it's essentially a snapshot of the long hauler community right now. As we've seen in previous surveys, this was a very healthy group pre-COVID. When asked to rate their previous health from 1 to 10, the modal average was 9. And now? Well, just the same as 6 months ago at the 2-year mark, the modal average is 3 out of 10. And this is a scale where 1 out of 10 is the worst health you can possibly imagine, so 3 is pretty frickin' awful. For reference, for this survey, I answered 9 on the first scale and 6 on this one. But how is this snapshot of first wave long haulers doing at 2.5 years compared to the similar snapshots we took of first wavers at 2 years and 18 months post-infection, given the caveats I mentioned earlier about not being able to exactly compare exactly the same people because we only keep about half of them between each survey. So that caveat aside, right now the mean well-being score is 4.38 out of 10. 6 months ago, it was 4.19. 12 months ago, it was 4.5. So this would suggest we're doing a bit better than we were 6 months ago, but worse than we were a year ago. Why? Well, before we can answer that, I think we need to address two major confounders in all of this, and that is cohort size and Omicron. First of all, let's take a look at how many first wavers have completed these surveys. 1 year ago, it was 2,250, 6 months ago, 1,437, and now 1,026. I do suspect there's a degree to which people have got fed up with surveys generally, but this trend of decreasing involvement suggests something else to me. That is that people are recovering and not necessarily frequenting the social media circles where this survey was shared, or perhaps they're better enough that they aren't as motivated to complete it. So what we might be looking at here are potentially the people who are still suffering rather than the entire group of first wave long haulers, or indeed the entire group of 2,250 that we saw a year ago at the 18-month mark. How about the reason for that drop between the 18-month mark and 2 years? Well, to my mind, it's simple, and it's the advent of Omicron. Reinfection set me back massively, and it seems I'm not alone. Over half of this cohort in the most recent survey felt they'd been reinfected versus 43% 6 months earlier. And what impact did it have on their long COVID symptoms once they'd recovered from the acute infection? Well, the red and blue here shows a worsening of their baseline versus green and purple for an improvement, which we might have expected to have with time anyway. So this would strongly suggest that reinfection has a negative impact on our recovery from long COVID. So what's the story of the last 6 months? Well, there would seem to be a significant proportion of first wavers who are recovering. Unfortunately, not all necessarily captured by this survey, and those who are still suffering are improving a little as long as they can avoid reinfection. That would be borne out by this chart, looking at how people feel they're doing now compared to 6 months ago, where we can see the green and purple slices of improvement being a little bigger than the red and blue of worsening symptoms. And worth noting that this is for the whole group, including those who have worsened after Omicron reinfection. How does the return to work pie look at 2.5 years? Well, essentially it's pretty much the same as it did at 2 years. So the rates of recovery haven't been significant enough to change the proportions going back to work. For reference, only 6.2% of this cohort are able to work full time without it impacting on their health. So the impact of the condition for those it's affecting remains absolutely massive. As for the most challenging aspects of the condition, it's the same top 5 as it was 6 months earlier. So at 5, the impact on relationships and family. At 4, breathlessness and respiratory issues. 3, tachycardia, palpitations and heart issues. At 2, neurological issues, with a huge lead over P3, as we've seen in previous surveys. And at number 1, our old friend, fatigue and post-exertional malaise. Now let's dive into some new questions for this survey. How many people had experienced one of significant joint pain, muscle pain, nerve pain or numbness? Well, the vast majority at 85%. And how many of these people had experienced this before their COVID infection? Well, only 4%. So I would be leaning towards causation rather than correlation in this scenario. How about the impact of long COVID on mental health and specifically mood? Well, a monstrous 80% reported a negative impact, either slight or severe. And the impact on anxiety levels? Well, pretty similar, although perhaps not quite as severe. It should, of course, go without saying that anxiety is not a risk factor or causative in the development of long COVID. The impact of mood and anxiety is secondary or perhaps even tertiary, a consequence of both the biological and chemical malfunctions in the body, as well as the horrific impacts of the condition on quality of life, including your ability to work, care for family, and maintain relationships. So on a more positive note, let's look at the people who'd filled in this survey who felt they had recovered. Take a look at this graph. There's a pretty big surge of recovery happening after the 2-year mark, which is extremely encouraging. Now, there may of course be a degree of selection bias here if we're comparing recovery at these stages compared to probability of recovering at earlier ones, but the fact there's this many recovering more than 2 years in should give everyone else some positive encouragement. The vast majority of this recovered group felt that they'd made a change that had catalysed their recovery. Now, of course, there may be a degree of confirmation bias here. If you change something and then get better, you're going to think it's that thing you changed. But let's take a look at what this group said. Well, not so much a change here for people because the number 1 factor is time. Number 2, pacing. Number 3, supplements. 4, medication, 5, diet management, and 6, alternative therapies. What's the one piece of advice they would give to someone who's yet to turn the corner? So here let's go through some long form answers given by people who responded to the survey. I'll scroll through them for 60 seconds, pause if you'd like to read, and if you'd like to skip ahead to the conclusions, then be my guest. Whilst over 500,000 people in the UK, according to ONS figures, and millions more around the world have been suffering with long COVID for more than 2 years, we might well be seeing a small wave of recovery from this first wave cohort. And the advice they're giving is, surprise, surprise, the same as the recovered group did at the previous mark 6 months earlier. Fundamentally, pacing and time are the 2 elements which are going to make the biggest difference. So, as much patience as it may have taken to stay on this path till now, it is worth persisting with patience and pacing, because the alternative is a continuous PEM hell, and nobody wants that. But to everyone out there who is still suffering with symptoms, the fact that people are recovering after 2 years should give significant hope that whatever the causes of long COVID are, the body is able to adapt or resolve them, given time and rest. Of course, there's still a hugely pressing need for treatment trials as well as investigative research into the pathophysiology of the condition. But for the time being, all is not lost, and time is indeed our friend as much as our foe. If you completed this survey yourself, you might have also noticed a series of questions investigating a link between hypermobility and long COVID. The early data on this is very promising, but does need some more crunching, so bear with me on that front and I will come back to you. In the meantime, look after yourselves. Until next time.